Professor Dustin J. Byrd, the floor is yours.
All right. So first, I have to say that the conference is sponsored by Icparosis Press, which is a relatively new publishing house that I started in 2019. And a work of sheer genius on Ali Shariati was published by it. It is this book here by Syed Javed Miri.
So I was going to mention that, but somehow I just got too distracted. Sorry. Yeah, that was fantastic. By the way, I did a review of that. I don't know if you guys saw that. I don't know what happened to that review.
Oh, but I sent it to Warren. I sent it to Warren Goldstein.
Wonderful, wonderful. But it's a great book by Syed Javed, collection of his essays on Shariati. Well worth the read. What I've got here is a paper I'm working on for another Shariati project that Syed Javed and I are preparing for, and it kind of overlaps a little bit with what Mehdi was talking about in terms of Gramsci. And I took a circuitous route to the study of Gramsci. I actually studied a lot of right-wing Gramsci thought, or the use of Gramsci's metapolitics among the far right, and that's how I came to study Gramsci. And in studying Gramsci, it became very clear to me that a lot of what he was talking about in terms of methodology of metapolitics was precisely what Ali Shariati was doing during the revolutionary period in Iran. So I tried to start to use Gramsci's prison notebooks to somehow elucidate, give some kind of theoretical structure to what was happening in the Iranian Revolution, or at least to Shariati's participation in the early period of that before his very unfortunate early death. So I'm actually going to read part of this, and Syed Javed, make sure if I get a little bit too far in time that you jump in and tell me to hush, because
sure. Don't worry.
I'm all about guten deutsche Ordnung, right? Good German order.
Don't worry.
Okay, so after the catastrophe of the First World War, the Italian political philosopher Antonio Gramsci, much like his peers in the Frankfurt School in Germany, sought to understand why the subaltern of conflicting European states sided with their nationalities over their class interests. Strictly following Marx's analysis, Gramsci thought the growth of class consciousness, which had developed within the European proletariat prior to the war, would lead the subaltern to fight for their common interests against their capitalist masters. He did not expect that such class consciousness would be wholly abandoned and replaced by fanatical nationalism, wherein the working class would slaughter each other for the benefit of their masters. It appeared that Marx's assumptions about class consciousness had either been wrong, or that his analysis was at best deficient. Something else was at play, something more powerful than the idea of class. Realizing this fact led Gramsci, while imprisoned in Mussolini's fascist state, to develop his concept of hegemony and metapolitics. It is the latter concept that this essay will explore in regards to Ali Shariati, the most brilliant metapolitical theoretician in the 20th century Iran. First, metapolitics is not singular. There are two main ways of thinking about metapolitics. First, metapolitics is the metalinguistic discourse about politics itself. In other words, it is a political dialogue about politics, through which the very vocabulary that is deployed to understand, interpret, and argue political subjects is developed. Who determines and/or controls the conceptual language through which we understand political, cultural, and economic events and realities has extraordinary leverage over their opponents, as it is through their semantics that the political struggle will be defined. Capture the mind within a given conceptual framework, and the individual gladly submits to that worldview. Secondly, metapolitics is a political struggle of ideas outside of the official center of political power. In other words, metapolitical struggles take place within the non-political institutions of society, including the family, civil society, the arts, and religion when it's not part of the state. This form of metapolitics is what Gramsci calls the war of position, wherein an ideological struggle between non-conforming voices contests the ideological apparatuses of the hegemonic state and its legitimating ideology. Gramsci realized that class consciousness was not enough to overcome the minds of those captive to the hegemonic ideology of the status quo. And thus the official and hegemonic ideology itself had to be undermined before success within the political institutions could occur. In other words, before the base, the political economic reality of a given society could be seized, it had to first be delegitimized via metapolitical struggles within the superstructure. Politics was downstream from culture. Marx had to be revised in light of his analysis that the superstructure was a mere epiphenomenon of the base. For Marx, whoever controlled the base controlled the superstructure. For Gramsci, the superstructure was the battlefield that had to be won before the base could be transformed. In other words, cultural hegemony had to be secured before the base could be transformed. Nevertheless, there was an abiding problem that Gramsci had to contend with. Who was to supply the political, cultural, and economic semantics that would contest the cultural hegemony of the status quo? Gramsci proposed a new type of intellectual, a non-traditional intellectual who married themselves to the cause of the subaltern, those subject to the cultural hegemony of the ruling class. He found his source among non-conforming intellectuals, those recalcitrant true and non-identical with official ideology. In their opposition to the ruling class, these non-conforming intellectuals, often philosophers, academics, journalists, and other theorists, would craft and propagate alternative concepts, narratives, and analyses that would question the official dogma of the ruling class, thus create intellectual and cultural space between the rulers and the ruled. Unlike what we are currently witnessing in the West, with the proliferation of populist conspiracy theories, fake news, and other narratives that are entirely divorced from reality, Gramsci's working class intellectuals would be rooted within one, the experience of the debased masses, and two, objective reality. Such intellectuals would not cater to the fantasies of the masses, but would rather guide them in such a way that it releases them from their somnambulant stupor, and thus de-reify the way they think about their condition. As such, Gramsci's working class intellectuals do not seek to manipulate the masses like populist demagogues, but rather educate them in the social constructs that determine their brutal life worlds. To quote Jesus of Nazareth, the truth will set them free, as it is the truth, not conspiracy theories and fantasies, that rationally disconnect the masses from the prevailing hegemonic ideology of the ruling class for their own benefit, whereas populist demagogues disconnect the masses from via irrationality for the benefit of the demagogue themselves. Additionally, Gramsci's working class intellectuals are there not only to demystify, delegitimate, and desanctify the ruling ideology, but also to point in the direction of a society that is rational, equitable, and based in the needs and the freedom of the many over the desires of the few, via a, quote, long march through the institutions, unquote, as Rudi Dutschke called metapolitics. Of course, Rudi Dutschke was the German student of Herbert Marcuse. The non-political institutions of societies arm the people not only with the rational means to undermine the hegemony of the status quo, but also the motivation to do so. By defining what ought to be the case, as opposed to upholding the metaphysics of what is the case, they liberate the people from their unquestioned acceptance of their debased realities. When the ruling class doubles down on its ideological assertions, which once held trance-like power over the masses, such verbiage falls on deaf ears. Infused with the reality principle, the linguistic conceptual apparatus of the ruling class no longer has the power to return the masses to their cleverly constructed yet false sirat al-mustaqim, or straight path, to use a Quranic phrase. This false straight path, once thought to be natural, legitimate, and the only true path, is now seen for what it is: false consciousness in the service of the powerful few over the desperate many. For Gramsci, once the ruling class loses the power of cultural hegemony over the masses, the state becomes vulnerable, as the people become ungovernable. As the people become ungovernable via the already established means of rulership, the state begins to collapse. The apparatus that it once relied upon to enforce its rule, in terms of the Shah would be Savak, for instance, no longer induces fear, and therefore no longer induces compliance. The state's policeman is the superego of its subjects, has been relieved of its duty. When the people are no longer afraid of the state and the ruling class, the war of position moves to the war of maneuver, an outright attempt to capture the apparatus of the state in the name of the intellectually liberated many. Now, how does Shariati fit into this? Although Shariati is often described as a revolutionary, he was not a revolutionary in the sense that he joined a military attempt to overthrow a government, as was the case with his contemporary Ernesto Che Guevara. The Revolutionary War of Maneuver, which occurred in many third world countries in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, was not what Shariati was destined to engage in. Rather, I argue that Shariati can be seen as an extraordinary combatant in the war of position, the metapolitical war by which the ruling cultural hegemony of the peacock throne was undermined, delegitimated, and desanctified, thus creating the space for the war of maneuver that occurred within the streets of many Iranian cities and leading to the eventual downfall of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah. Although Shariati's nonconformist education began under the tutelage of his father, Mohammed Taqi, it took a momentous developmental leap when he studied in Paris. Thrust into the cultural wars of France in the 1960s, within a broader European society coming to grips with its crumbling empires, Shariati added to his Shi'i education the works of Karl Marx, various neo-Marxists, Jean-Paul Sartre, Frantz Fanon, and other third world theorists. Although he studied their works, which were predominantly nationalist and secular in their approach, Shariati could not abandon his religious roots or his own religiosity, as attested to in his letters back and forth with Frantz Fanon. Islam, especially Shi'i Islam, with its long tradition of suffering, repentance, and the sense of historical marginalization and victimization, had to have a role within the liberation struggles already simmering in Iran, according to Shariati. Through his studies of the sociology of religion, he's continuously witnessed the emancipatory potentials of religion, especially when religion preserved and actualized its prophetic roles as the grand inquisitor of the status quo. As such, when he returned to Iran in 1964 with his Ph.D. in hand, his determinate negation of the Shi'i tradition, married to the revolutionary class consciousness that he found within his studies abroad, led him to immediately begin his metapolitical work. The threat of his so-called Red Shi'ism, as it was later called, was recognized by the Shah's regime, and Shariati, as you all know, was imprisoned immediately upon his return to Iran. Although this was meant to silence his critique of the Shah and his allies in the West, especially the United States, it had the opposite effect. Shariati doubled down on his critique, and it became even more potent. The result of his recalcitrance, as well as his novel interpretation of the Shi'i tradition and its revolutionary potential, his lectures at Mashhad University in the Hosseiniya Ershad were well attended. It is at this point wherein Shariati was targeted by the Shah's regime, giving him political credibility, combined with the power and uniqueness of his analyses and the willingness of his students to follow him out of the official ideology of the regime and its white revolution, that we begin to see Shariati as the most important metapolitical combatant in the early days of the revolution. Thrust into a situation defined by the Shah's ongoing westernization and capitalization of Iran, which created social resentment, economic catastrophes, rapid cultural changes, coupled with the mass psychosis of Ghamzadegi, West toxification among certain segments of the population, in conjunction with clerical quietism, Shariati's political philosophy began to shift the political, economic, and cultural language in favor of radical change. Unlike other intellectuals who suffered from what Sayyid Hussein Alatas called the captive mind, being dependent on the philosophical and sociological jargon and arguments of the West, Shariati's Western influences were subsumed within traditional Islamic concepts. Such Islamic concepts were not mere veneer for his analyses, as some critics have argued. Shariati did not smuggle secular Western philosophy into Iran via a religious cover, but rather allowed the Western philosophical tradition to renew, in terms of the Arabic term tajdid, the dormant radicality and revolutionary nature of the Shia Islam itself. As resentment toward the Shah grew, a greater need for an alternative rendering of the Shi'i tradition also grew, and Shariati was in the process of developing that alternative reading of the Shi'i tradition, as well as propagating it to the subaltern masses. This puts him in a very important place. Had Shariati abandoned Islam for a secular revolutionary theory and politics, and it's unlikely he would have succeeded in transforming the concepts, semantics, and Islamic vocabulary that was needed to create cleavage between the people, the state, and the quietist clerics. A recalcitrant voice from within the Shi'i tradition, which took the religion seriously while liberated it from its ossified clerical form, was needed to move the masses from accepting the traditional state clerical hegemony. While the chasm was already growing due to the Shah's own politics and his own policies, it was the revolutionary reorientation of Islam that began to shift the public consciousness as the emancipatory worldview that Shariati developed began to saturate the minds of many. This metapolitical reorientation of Shi'i concepts was so alarming to many of the more conservative clerical authorities that Imam Khomeini, another rising voice against the Shah, was repeatedly asked by senior clerics to condemn Shariati in his non-canonical interpretation of Shi'i Islam. Whether Khomeini agreed with Shariati in part or in whole, or not at all, he nevertheless refused to condemn Shariati and decree his works as un-Islamic, as Shariati's metapolitical struggle against the Shah served Khomeini's interests as well. Both Khomeini, from within the clerical establishment, and Shariati from outside of the clerical establishment, contributed to a new interpretation of Islamic concepts, which galvanized the masses against the Shah. As stated before, Shariati's emancipatory reading of the Shi'i tradition allowed him to reinterpret basic Islamic categories in ways that delivered them to social and political dynamics, as opposed to social and political statics, as religion is so often in the service to. For example, and Mati talked a little bit about this, the translation of Tawheed, usually a theological concept, from being a strictly theological category into being a social political category, was rooted within the seerah, or the biography of the Prophet himself, but had long lost its social political significance as the Prophet's authority became routinized within Islamic history and society. The theological concept of Tawheed does not allow for anything or anyone to be deified, to be absolutized, to argue itself beyond its createdness and therefore its finitude. Such is kufr in Shariati's analysis. Thus, Tawheed is the ultimate ideology critique in regards to theological falsities, right? And also now socio-political falsities. When translated into a socio-political category, it becomes a powerful tool in the hands of critics of political regimes and the dictators and demagogues, or what Shariati called ma'la, the insatiable people who live in luxury, and mutrif, the rulers. No power can claim to be the end of history, the absolute apex of human society, a utopia realized, as a utopia realized is the perfect society, and perfection belongs to God alone, right? Such powers are engaged in political shirk or polytheism when they claim to have realized certain attributes of God, right? The necessity for such a concept becomes especially important when religion and politics entwine, as they did with the Safavid state, which would produce what Shariati would call Black Shiism. Social statics, the perpetuation of the status quo and the preservation of power and social hierarchy was the concern of Black Shi'ism, whereas social dynamics and the emancipation of the subaltern remained at the core of Shariati's concept of red Shi'ism. Another example of Shariati's metapolitical reinterpretation of traditional Shi'i categories can be found in his teaching on Karbala. The term Karbala generally is invoked when thinking about the brutal assassination of Hussein, his family, and his companions, the Ahl Bayt, the 10th of Muharram, at the hands of Yazid ibn Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Ashura is a single historical event having taken place within a particular time and place. As a determining event in Islamic history, this past event partially determines Shi'i identity. Yet, in the traditional reading, Ashura is a fixed event, one that ought to be remembered but remains in the past. For Shariati, Karbala is not just a past moment in time, it is literally timeless. It is a state of being, a condition that determines the present because it is present within the present. As such, Karbala is a process of becoming not a static identity, but a reality, a Jetztzeit in German, a now time, as Walter Benjamin called it. And thus it continually demands attention. Every day is Ashura, every place is Karbala, as Shariati said, is a demand to see every moment in time as being saturated with the injustice of Karbala, to see all places in the world as being saturated with that same injustice. Karbala, in the way Shariati reformulated it, is not merely remembrance of the event of Karbala, but the realization that Karbala is the condition of human history. Additionally, if tauba, repentance, is to be found for past injustices and past mistakes, it will be found in the present, in what Walter Benjamin called our weak messianic power, our ability to, the ability of the present to redeem the past. This interpretation of Karbala is a very different way to approach the assassination of Hussein, one that provokes attentiveness, alertness, and engagement in the political realities as a way of being in the world. It also suggests that Muslims ought to be concerned with human suffering and oppression wherever and whenever it occurs. We treat the remembrance of events very differently than we treat events that are occurring in the contemporary moment, especially when they're occurring around us. However, if every day is Ashura and every place is Karbala, then even after the Islamic Revolution, Karbala remains the condition, right? So if you think about the Marx tradition that you know, all of history is the history of class consciousness, for Shariati, all the history is the history of Karbala, right? That's human history, it's the condition. So therefore, Karbala in many ways for Shariati is a call for perpetual revolution, not a momentary outburst of revolutionary fervor designed to remove a dictatorial regime, which it is, but a complete sea change in how we approach life, the actualization of the good and the never-ending strive towards a just society. By reinterpreting these Islamic concepts that all Shi'i Muslims are familiar with, in a way that awakens their dormant revolutionary potentials, Shariati delivers a vocabulary of emancipation to the subaltern. In this way, he is not in the streets with the students, the bazaris, the workers, and others who oppose the Shah. Rather, he is constructing the very worldview through which they understand the struggle they are engaged in. By doing so, he separates the subaltern from the semantic and ideological scaffolding that legitimates both the clerical and the political status quo. Additionally, his metapolitical reformation of basic Islamic concept is a call for Muslims to engage in cultural, political, and economic struggles of today, as Karbala is still our condition in the present moment.